Greg Rucka recently went on the Word Balloon podcast with John Suntra, aired his grievances about Geoff Johns and Dan DiDio in a way that I've never actually heard expressed, especially about Dan DiDio. And apparently it affected him greatly, really hurt his mental health. And when he left the company the first time in 2009, it was not a good place to be if you were Greg Rucka. And he obviously holds a lot of ill will and distaste for that era. And he has a lot of bad memories. Before we get into that, I do want to say thank you very much to the sponsor of this video and the channel, the 616 Comics. If you haven't checked them out on 616comics.com, you can get 10% off their retailer exclusive variant covers using the code in the video description. Greg Rucka described his time at DC Comics from 2006 to 2009 as dark times under Dan DiDio and Geoff Johns. He said the environment was toxic, built on deception and manipulation. In his words, Geoff Johns was incredibly manipulative to me, used me, lied to me, played me off against people. Dan DiDio did the same thing. Editorial dysfunction was everywhere, with broken promises and undermined projects, including War of the Supermen. Rucka called that period of my absolute lowest at DC, pointing to the strained collaborations and culture of abuse. He believed the behavior was deliberate, designed to divide editorial groups and keep them at odds. The toll was devastating. When I left in 2009, I was mentally ill. I was severely depressed, suicidal. I nearly took my life, Rucka admitted. And it's very sad to hear that Greg Rucka went through that and was suicidal for a time. And he kind of blames it on his time at DC Comics, which is pretty surprising because he had worked on some really major characters, including Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, the Trinity. But the things that really stand out to me for Greg Rucka are really his Wonder Woman run. To me, it's the second greatest Wonder Woman run in the history of the character, and Wonder Woman's been around for over 80 years. And he really elevated Wonder Woman in a way that nobody had done really since George Perez, the greatest Wonder Woman run of all times. So he had a good reputation at the time, and certainly even on Batman when he did No Man's Land, that is a great fucking story. That one also, leaves an indelible mark on Batman and DC Comics. And in No Man's Land is one of the most underrated Batman stories of all time. The way that I understood it, the reason that he was mad and had left DC Comics to begin with, and I thought it was in 2010, he was pissed off because he was supposed to get the Wonder Woman Earth 1 book, but he didn't get that gig. It ended up going to Grant Morrison, and certainly Grant Morrison took that ball and ran with it. But it does feel like there was a grudge held with Dan DiDio there. The weird thing is, the people that I've talked to are very glowing about their time working with Dan DiDio. They liked his leadership style. They felt like he really took care of creators. Dan DiDio was like the human shield for the creative process there. And he would just go out there and say, nope, that was on me. I made that decision. If you have a problem with it, take it up with me. And he had a reputation of going out there and keeping the guys, employed. So I'm very, very surprised to hear this from Greg Rucka, because I don't normally hear that from DC Comics creators at the time. Now, fans have a different impression. I'll be one of those, because I've definitely made my share of Dan DiDio fucked up DC Comics videos, and he might have had some great ideas like the New 52, which certainly worked out when it happened, but he wasn't able to continue that on, and he did seem to have a bit of creative ADHD. When something worked, he just wanted to pivot on to something else. Now, as far as Geoff Johns, I've certainly heard a lot behind the scenes at DC Comics, not specifically when Geoff Johns was there only. When you hear a story, from the WWF or WWE about what's happening behind the curtains, and there's like cliques of dudes that get together, they're always vying for power. That sounded like what it was going on at DC Comics a lot of the times. And I imagine Geoff Johns being their premier writer a lot of that time, he would have been the head guy of one of the factions, trying to look out for his friends and getting, some of the premier gigs. But certainly Scott Snyder would have been one of the leader guys, Tom King would have been a guy that had his own little group that was vying for power at a time. When Brian Michael Bendis arrived, he threw everything into flux, politicking behind the scenes, trying to gain more power. But I've never really heard of Geoff Johns undercutting or manipulating or going out of his way to screw over other creators. Certainly there have been other accusations of Geoff Johns maybe not being the most easy person to work with or for. We did have the Ray Fisher story out there, but I hadn't heard a lot of stories saying, yeah, Geoff Johns was completely unprofessional and was just screwing people over left and right. I have heard that about other creators, but not about him so much. But there definitely was professional rivalry behind the scenes, and there are different groups of creators kind of vying for, kind of creative control. What's the direction of DC? So I could see how Greg Rucka could come away with that. Now, he did return when Geoff Johns had been promoted to chief creative officer. Dan DiDio was still co-publisher with Jim Lee, and they were basically running everything. After leaving DC in 2009, Rucka said the company worked hard to lure him back, especially in 2016. As the Wonder Woman movie approached, executives admitted they had mishandled the character, telling him, "We have a Wonder Woman movie coming out, and we forked the character into a cocked hat." Screwed the pooch. Rucka agreed to return, but only on his terms, submitting a written list of demands. He described DC's position at the time as desperate, saying they were on their knees. His comeback lasted about a year before he left again, calling the arrangement unsustainable. Another attempt in 2019, encouraged by colleagues like Brian Michael Bendis, also ended in disappointment when promises weren't kept. Once more, he walked away, unwilling to repeat the cycle. And I will fully admit this, while certainly Greg Rucka has made his mark on Wonder Woman, it is only in his initial run. When he returns to the character during DC Rebirth, he never really recaptured the magic. They'd put Brian Azzarello on Wonder Woman, and he made a lot of fucking changes, and they didn't make a whole lot of sense. So a lot of what Greg Rucka was doing during DC Rebirth was trying to pick up the pieces or even rebuild the pieces of what Brian Azzarello had done with the character, and it never really stuck. It never really hit. And then you compound that with the fact that DC Rebirth, almost across the board, was like sterling. And there were just a lot of things to get excited about at DC Comics during Rebirth. And Wonder Woman under Greg Rucka, even with a lot of great covers from like Liam Sharp and stuff, just wasn't one of them. It was an afterthought. It sounds like he chalks a lot of that up to editorial interference. But the weird thing is, when Geoff Johns has more power and more creative control during this DC Rebirth era, he doesn't talk about it quite like he does the previous era. So I found that kind of contradicting to what he was trying to say there. You would have thought it would have gotten worse when he returned. The stuff that he did in 2016 pales in comparison to what he did when he said it was the worst that it had ever been. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because his best creative years were almost all when he says he was completely miserable because everyone was screwing him over. Maybe he just had really good editorial oversight and they were making sure that he was delivering bangers. I'm not really sure. But he also returned in 2019. The less said about that, the better. He definitely had come down with a severe case of TDS at the time. It was kind of embarrassing. Greg Rucka got this Lois Lane book, and she had this like laptop that says like, "My laptop kills fascists," or something stupid like that. Made no sense to the character, considering she's always been conservative in DC Comics, or perhaps even a Republican. I would be pissed off too, and I wouldn't want to remember those days if I were him. Now, he has returned to DC Comics, and it sounds, at least for Greg Rucka, like things are much better now. Rucka says the DC Comics of today is a very different place. He credits the current editorial team with building a healthier, more collaborative environment. "I'm working with 3 editors at DC right now. All of them have been terrific," he explained, praising improved professionalism and communication. One editor assured him, "It's different now. Editorial gets along and we communicate." That, Rucka noted, stands in sharp contrast to the DiDio and Johns era, when editorial groups were constantly at war. For fans, these changes mean stronger stories, fewer behind-the-scenes issues, and more stability. His involvement in projects like Cheetah and Cheshire Rob, the Justice League of 2025, shows his renewed willingness to work with the company. Still, Rucka is cautious. "I've had bad experiences. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to go back to that," he said. "The question remains whether this positive shift will last." The vision that I've gotten of DC Comics from the people that I talk to, and the vision that Greg Rucka has of it from his perspective, are almost like 180 degrees. But they basically fired all their good editors that had good experience and knew how to lead lines and stuff like that. And it's kind of been chaos. Now, it is apparently getting better because we are getting higher quality books. But even now, with the books that they have, they're not anywhere close to the sales or even quality of a DC Rebirth when Geoff Johns and Dan DiDio would have fully been in charge. They aren't anywhere close to the amount of buzz and sales that they had during the New 52, which was a Dan DiDio baby, and certainly Geoff Johns would have been a huge part of that as well. And they don't have as much success as they did even during some of those pre-New 52 days when Greg Rucka was there at his best doing his finest work. So while it might be easier for him personally because maybe the standards have lowered and maybe you don't have to write to the quality that they wanted you to or demanded that you did back in the past, none of these big changes have led to increased sales or interest other than the absolute line, which Greg Rucka isn't a part of. So I'm glad that he's happier. I don't want to hear that somebody is having such a negative time and things are so bad that they've gotten, depressed or suicidal and things like that. I'm glad that he's in a much better headspace, but it is weird that his best work was done when he says things that DC Comics were at their worst. And certainly the sales and everything also coincide with those being better days, just as far as interest and buzz and excitement about DC Comics. Now, I did mention the New 52, and I thought I'd bring this one back, an oldie but goodie. I had a conversation with our good friend Comics by Perch a few years ago talking about the New 52, the way that it just blew up, and then the reason that it fell and it didn't sustain itself long term. If you'd like to watch an oldie but goodie, here it is right here. Check it out. Also, I want to say I appreciate the time and keep thinking critical.